the criminal justice one, and that's the debtor's paradox, where there's the guy who's in debt. He doesn't have much money, but he's quite clever. He goes up to his creditor and says, look, things change over time. Would you agree to that? If I add, a pebble to this pile of rocks, it's not the same pile. And the creditor says, sure, yeah, that makes sense. And the debtor says, okay, well, I'm not the, look, I put on 5 pounds since the last time I saw you. So clearly I'm not the same person, therefore I don't owe you any money. And he says, so what are you going to do about that? So the creditor looks at him and punches him in the face, knocks him down. And the debtor gets up and says, well, why'd you do that? And the guy says, well, look, I just lost some skin cells from punching you in the face, so I'm not the same person, so you can't hold me accountable for it. So that's an interesting reply to this idea that our identities are bound up in our bodies and change from moment to moment. The other one we considered was the ship of Theseus, and that's the one where there was the ship in Greece where it was on display for many years, and as it started to age, they replaced the planks with new planks. And the question becomes, at what point does that ship stop becoming the ship of Theseus? And then Thomas Hobbes, another famous philosopher in like the 18th century, brought up the like a twist on it and said, look, what if somebody takes the old planks and builds those old planks into a new ship? What do you have? So you got the plank, the ship that's been replaced with all the new boards, which is supposed to represent the ship of Theseus, and yet you have the material from the old ship of Theseus that's been built into a new ship. Which one is the ship of Theseus? And then the question we looked at was the statue and the clay. It makes sense to think that, look, the statue and the clay are made out of the same materials. All the statue is a certain material that's shaped in a certain way. So it makes sense to think, the statue and the clay are the same things. But when we look a little bit deeper into the problem, we see that there are several issues that come up with this. One of the principles that we looked at is called Leibniz's law, or it's also known as the identity of indiscernibles. And essentially what that says is that two or more objects are identical if they possess exactly the same properties. And as we talked about, that's a qualitative identity. But so taken in the case of the statue and the clay, we see that there are several different properties that the statue and the clay don't have that are identical. For instance, let's say the piece of clay was created at 10 a.m. You picked it up from the shop and shaped it a certain way, and then you've got that at 10 a.m. So the clay comes into existence at 10 a.m. The statue, let's say you make at 2 p.m. So the statue doesn't come into existence until 2 p.m. So the clay has the property of coming into existence at 10 a.m. The statue comes in at 2 p.m. Therefore, there's a property right there that they don't share. So according to Leibniz's law, they're not identical. Another objection to the statue and the clay being equal is that they have different persistence conditions. So you have a piece of clay that's defined by having all of its pieces together, right? A section of clay. So Thompson gives this example, right, where the clay has already been fashioned into the statue, but slightly before 3 p.m. somebody breaks off the arm of the statue, and they drop the piece of clay that the statue was made from on the floor, but they take another piece of clay and they replace the statue's arm. Now, we want to say that the statue still exists, right? I mean, we even gave the example of where nobody puts another arm on it, things like the Venus de Milo and things like that, where it's lost its arm over time, but we still want to say it's the same statue. But we can't say it's the same piece of clay, because the identity conditions for the clay are that it consists of this many pieces of clay put together. So that seems like another property that they don't share. And the final thing is that they differ in form or kind. A statue is clearly defined by the shape that it takes, but the clay is clearly not. For instance, she gives the example, we can take the statue and smash it onto the ground, and the statue ceases to exist, but the clay still exists. So the bottom line is it seems like there are lots of properties where it's not the case that the statue and the clay are identical because they don't share the same properties. But this leads us into a problem, because we have something called the impenetrability thesis that we have to deal with. And that the impenetrability thesis says that the same, two things cannot exist in the same place at the same time. But that's exactly what appears to be the case with the statue and the clay, right? Because we just said the statue and the clay are two distinct things. They're not identical. But yet, when you have the statue and the clay both existing in the same place at the same time. So this is a problem, a paradox. And Thompson tries to, get out of it a couple of different ways. She says, look, it's not that they're identical, but what's going on is the clay, the statue is constituted by the clay. The statue is made up of the clay. So it's the statue is a certain manifestation of the clay, and then she starts talking about these things like temporary properties, right? So temporary properties, she says, can be like, for instance, being the wife of, or being hungry, things that sort of come and go at a time. And she says, look, why can't shape be just a temporary property? Why can't being a statue be a temporary property of the clay? So, for instance, the statue and the clay are not identical. Rather, the statue is just one particular form or mode of the clay. And in that way, the statue constitutes the clay. And then another way out of the problem is, look, you can just say Leibniz's law is wrong, which goes along with our identity thesis. That like two things, for instance, I can be the same person as I was when I was 10 years old. And that clearly violates Leibniz's law, right? Because, look, my properties are not the same as I was when I was 10, but yet I still want to say that I'm numerically identical to, I'm still the same numerically identical entity, but we're certainly not qualitatively identical. So why can't that be the case for the statue and the clay? Maybe they are identical, but it's not the case that they have to share the same properties to be so. So that was personal identity this past week. This week we're going to be looking at Chisholm again, at identity through time, and we'll get a little bit more into the ship of Theseus with that. It's an interesting article. And then we'll look at a really interesting article on Thursday called Identity and Necessity by a philosopher who's actually still living, if you can believe it. Thompson's still living too, but anyway, he's talking about Hesperus and Phosphorus, the evening star and the morning star. So that makes, and whether the evening star and the morning star are actually the same thing. And if you're interested, you can find out what the evening star and the morning star actually are. They're not even stars. That's just a hint. But anyway, we'll talk about that on Thursday. See you Tuesday.